for having me here today. Excited to talk about invasive aquatic plants. My name is Wes Glisson. I'm the aquatic plant specialist for the Washington State Department of Ecology, and I'm just going to be going over some priority invasive aquatic plants in Washington State. So to start us off, I wanted to take a step back and talk about just aquatic plants in general, especially our native aquatic plants. A lot of folks, when they see aquatic plants in a lake or water body, they might necessarily think that they are bad, but our native aquatic plants are really important for our aquatic ecosystem. So they provide food and habitat for a variety of species, including invertebrates, amphibians, fish, water birds, and mammals. They maintain water clarity. They stabilize shorelines, and they regulate water chemistry and nutrient flow in our aquatic systems. And here's just a couple pictures of some of our native aquatic plants here, just to show you the wonderful diversity that we have. Aquatic plants are also provide culturally significant foods, medicines, materials, and relatives. So here's just a couple examples. So wapido, also known as arrowhead, and the scientific name being Sagittaria, that's the species in the upper right here, has been traditionally harvested for its roots or tubers as a food source. Minomen, or wild rice, scientific name Zizania species. These are harvested specifically out east and are a wonderful food source. And then cattails, many folks are familiar with those, have a variety of uses, one of which example here is just basket making. So these are really important culturally, these aquatic plants that are native here. But moving on to invasive aquatic plants, this picture really displays nicely what happens when an invasive aquatic plant enters a water body or a natural system. So on our left here, we have this diverse native plant community, which has a number of different species. We have our pondweeds, maybe some native milfoils, and we can see that this supports a variety of wildlife and invertebrate species and provides healthy ecosystem functioning. But oftentimes when we see invasive aquatic plants come into a system, they produce these monocultures, so where there's only one dominant plant species, and this provides poor quality habitat for fish and wildlife and the aquatic ecosystem. These also cause issues with recreation, boat access, things of that nature that are really harmful to humans. So with that very brief intro, I'm going to go over 5 of our highest priority invasive aquatic plants in Washington State. And a number of these have already been touched on by folks who spoke before me, so I'll probably go a little bit faster through some of those species. But these species are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf water milfoil, flowering rush, parrot feather, and floating primrose willow. So to start us off, this is one that probably most folks are familiar with, Eurasian water milfoil, or Myriophyllum spicatum. This plant is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's been in Washington for quite a long time, since the 1960s, and out east even longer, so since about the turn of the last century. This is a Class B noxious weed. So as Anne mentioned earlier, this is fairly widespread, and I'll show a distribution map, but it is still designated for control in some areas of the state. Importantly, this plant hybridizes with a native water milfoil, and that causes issues with essentially swamping out the genetics of that native species, which is problematic. Excuse me, in terms of ID, again, most folks are familiar with this plant, but just to give you just some more ideas about how to ID it, it has a column-like shape in the water column, finely dissected leaves, and those are going to be found in whorls around the stem. So this picture up here at the top has a nice demonstration of that. It's also going to have a small flowering stalk. It doesn't always flower, but when it does, it's going to look like this picture here in the center. There's going to have very tiny but not noticeable leaves. So essentially, you'll just see this little spike that's coming above the water column, and that will distinguish it from another species that I'm going to mention next. Here's just some pictures of Eurasian water milfoil infestation. So as you can see, it grows up through the water column and then tops out on the surface, which again is problematic for both our native plants, and that it can shade those out and change the water temperature and things of that nature, but also for our recreation on our lakes. You imagine you wouldn't want to be swimming through this or driving your boat through this infestation here. Here's just another photo showing a very dense infestation of Eurasian water milfoil. In terms of its distribution across the US and in Washington, as I mentioned, it's fairly widespread across the United States and Washington. This map here in the lower left just showing the water bodies that are known to be infested in Washington State. You might look at this and say, oh, all hope is lost. But we've been pretty good at being able to eradicate some populations when they've been found, and prevent this plant from getting into other water bodies. So I'm going to move on to another milfoil species. And Schuster mentioned this species. This is variable leaf water milfoil, similar to Eurasian water milfoil, but I'm going to note some key differences here. So first, this plant is actually native to the Southeast United States, but it's not native here. So it was very clearly brought here. It's popular in the aquarium trade, and that's likely how it arrived in Washington State. It was first found in Washington in 2006. It's a Class A noxious weed, so because it has such a limited distribution, it is slated for eradication wherever it is found. Importantly, and again, as Anne mentioned earlier, this hybridizes with a native water milfoil that's actually relatively rare. And again, this causes issues with swamping out that native plant, the genetics of that native plant. So some key differences here. Again, it's another milfoil, so it has some similarities to Eurasian water milfoil and having those feathery leaves underneath the water column. But the key difference is that when it actually produces a flowering stalk, it's going to have these very kind of chunky oval leaves that are going to be up out of the water column. So that's kind of a dead giveaway that this is a variable leaf water milfoil as opposed to Eurasian or some of our other water milfoils. Overall, it's going to have a much bushier appearance, and there's going to be a smaller space in between those whorls of leaves. So again, just a very bushy plant in the water column. Here's some photos. Actually, this plant is invasive in Europe. So these photos are actually from some European waterways. But just to give you an idea of how dense these plants can grow in the water column. And I always like to highlight this. There's a little bird that's actually walking on top of these plants in this canal system here. These photos, I think, are actually from Germany and France. But just a tremendous amount of growth, something that we don't want to see in our water bodies here. This plant can also survive terrestrially. So these plants here are all variable leaf water milfoil that have survived water drawdown. And actually can produce a terrestrial form that grows up out of moist sediment. And then again, another picture here from a lake in Washington, just showing that very bushy, dense growth in the water column. In terms of its distribution here, just want to point out in this map here, the orange coloration is for areas where this plant is native, and then the kind of rust brown color is areas where it has invaded or been introduced. So you can see in the Northeast United States, it's been introduced to that region, and then here in Washington. Here's just a distribution map of its Washington populations. It's a very limited distribution on the western part of the state. Unfortunately, there's been a handful of new infestations found down in Clark County. So if you're in that region, this is definitely something to be aware of and keep an eye out for. All right, moving on to flowering rush. This is a species that has already been talked about a little bit. Blaine mentioned the species and gave a little description, so I'll just add to some of that information. This plant's native to Europe and Asia. It's been in Washington since at least the 1990s, likely before then. We just didn't notice it. This is another Class A noxious weed. I just wanted to display some pictures here because this plant can be really tough to ID, especially if it's not flowering. So kind of the key giveaways are its leaves. So these can actually be both emergent, so growing up out of the water or even just on moist soil, or fully submerged. They're triangular. Towards the tips, they're going to actually twist. So that's another key giveaway that's going to be very different than what we might see with our cattails or other native emergent plants. They're also going to flatten out towards that tip. If it does produce flowers, it's going to have these big showy flower clusters that are going to have small pink flowers. In terms of reproduction, it's primarily going to reproduce by these buds and fragments. So that picture on the lower right shows those rhizomes that will actually break off and then form new plants within a water body or a river system. Here's just some photos to show you the kind of variation that flowering rush can have and grow in a number of different habitats. So up to 20 feet of water depth. It can also grow in moist soil. It can survive drying out in some of these pictures, as you can see. In this picture that I've added kind of to the center here, let's see if I can get my laser pointer going, is actually just on wet soil in Lake Roosevelt in the Columbia River, growing up in the spring. So it can really survive a lot of different habitats. In terms of its distribution throughout the state, This map is produced by WSDA. Where flowering rush is present, those locations are marked with the red dots and absent being the green dots. So as you can see, fairly widely distributed throughout the Columbia and its tributaries, including the Pend Oreille, the Spokane, and the Yakima River. Luckily, it hasn't been found any lower than the John Day Dam on the lower Columbia River. And there's lots of folks working across the state to try to control this species and keep it from spreading any further. I'll also mention there's a couple disjunct populations here on Joint Base Lewis McChord in Pierce County, and then up in Silver Lake in Whatcom County. And so far, those populations have been managed and been contained to those water bodies where they currently occur. So parrot feather, this is another actual milfoil species mentioned by the genus there, Myriophyllum, but it grows quite differently than the other milfoils that I've mentioned. So this one's native to South America. It's been in Washington since the 1970s. It's currently a Class B noxious weed. So again, it's got a fairly wide distribution, but it's still designated for control in many areas where it hasn't spread to. In terms of ID, it's actually the primary thing that you'll look for is it's gonna have this emergent leaf stalk with these finely dissected leaves. So Anne mentioned that variable leaf water milfoil is gonna have those finely dissected leaves underneath the water and then those kind of bigger leaves above the water column. This one's always gonna have those finely dissected leaves both above the water column and below. So oftentimes you'll see it growing emergently. Here it is growing up on the shore. And here's just a nice photo of those emergent leaf stalks. So very distinct from really any other species that we're going to have here in Washington State. It's going to have, again, whorls of leaves, finely dissected, usually about 4 to 6 of those leaves per whorl. There's only female plants in North America. Usually you're not going to be able to see those flowers to be able to tell that apart, but just an FYI that these are primarily spreading via fragmentation, not sexual reproduction.
Just about 3 minutes left, Wes.
Okay, thanks. So here's some more photos of this plant growing in wetlands and other areas in Washington. So you can see how dense those plants grow. Again, here's its distribution across the United States and in Washington State. So it's fairly just spread in the western part of the state, but it has a widespread distribution in other parts of the US. All right, last plant here. This is floating primrose willow, or Ludwigia peploides. This plant has been popular in the ornamental trade. It actually has different nativity based on different subspecies, but the important thing to note is that none of these subspecies are native to Washington. So this is a non-native plant in Washington State. It's another Class A noxious weed. It was first found in 2004 in King County. I believe that infestation has been eradicated, but then we just found, unfortunately, a new infestation in Thurston County just last year. So luckily, we were able to coordinate with the noxious weed program there, and they're working on eradicating that plant at that location. But it's definitely one I wanted to touch on today because it has this very showy flower here. So if it's something that folks can keep an eye out for around the state. In terms of ID, again, I mentioned that flower, it's got those 5 yellow petals. The flowers only last for about a day, so you might see them one day and then they're gone the next. It's going to have these roots that can actually root in wet soil or just freely in the water column. And this picture shows it nicely. They're kind of these kind of fleshy white roots that it'll actually have in the water column. So that's another giveaway. Not many of our other aquatic plants are going to have those. It'll also these shiny alternate leaves. So that's another giveaway too. So here's just some pictures. This is the population that's in Chambers Lake here in Thurston County. You can see kind of spreading into the water with these stems here, and then another picture of these kind of fleshy white roots that form at the nodes. Here again, a very limited distribution. Why it's a Class A, we still have a chance to eradicate the species in the state. So again, very limited distribution here in Washington. All right, just want to end with how to report some infestations. If you see any of these plants, you can go to the Washington Invasive Species Council webpage, where they have a great reporting app. Also, if you see things, you just have questions about ID, feel free to email me. My email's there. I'll put it at the end of the presentation as well, and I can drop it in the chat. Send me pictures of as many of the plant parts as you can. I'd be happy to help ID. It's part of my job, so happy to do that. Lastly, I just want to end with this message, go through this quickly. Justin Bush mentioned this. It's basic steps everyone can take. Clean your boat and your gear when you're leaving a water body. Drain all water from your boat. and then dry out your boat, your gear, your equipment, whether it's wiping it down or letting it sit out for a couple of days, as long as you can for that to fully dry out before going to another water body. Really appreciate the time here today. Happy to answer questions later. If you feel to drop them in the chat, there's just my contact info. So thank you for having me, and happy to answer any questions later on.